Across the world, in multiple countries, we are at a tipping point. As climate change concerns become ever more pressing and its destructive effects become even more visible, people are more and more looking for both governments to act decisively and for ways they themselves can shift their own transport towards a cleaner, greener future. Whether that's simply driving less, walking and cycling more, or using more public transport, or, for those who need to drive, shifting to a battery-powered electric vehicle, we're increasingly seeing the EV ownership numbers hit that magical tipping point where something goes from a vague knowledge of its existence to being ubiquitous. It's that iPhone moment when it seemed to almost overnight shift from people tapping away on their Blackberries and Nokias to everyone having a smartphone. But are we, in the EV world, ready? Typically, with technology adoption, if you can crest 10 to 15% and it's a technology that's actually useful, you're into a magical zone. Enough people then encounter a turbo encabulator, and they see it being used on a daily basis. They know that it exists, and they start thinking about having some prefabulated amulite of their very own. At that point, adoption of new devices or technologies generally shoots upwards in what's referred to as the S-shaped curve of technology adoption. Having taken years to get from 0 to 10%, it can take only a few more years to get to 80 to 90% market penetration. And across Europe and in the US, we're there. We've talked before about how close we are to hitting that sudden climb in EV ownership percentage, that same adoption curve that saw 92% of vehicles sold in Norway in March being vehicles with a plug, of which over 86% were battery electric vehicles. But as we've talked about, it feels like in the US, in other parts of Europe, in Australia, in many African nations, in India, infrastructure and markets seem to be lagging behind. So the question is that true? And how do you measure it? Well, that's a question that Arthur D. Little, an international business consulting firm, set out to identify and calculate for 15 different countries around the world, using a baseline of buying an EV as an equivalent level of cost, simplicity and functionality to buying an internal combustion engine vehicle, a set of conditions that scored at 100 points. It looked at various factors that are likely to impact consumer adoption of EVs. It divvied up these factors into 5 major categories: macroeconomic market factors, the EV market and competitive landscape, customers' readiness to adopt EVs, the public charging landscape in each country, and finally, the total cost of ownership and related regulations that factor into that. This pile of 5 categories actually gets broken down further into 45 subcomponents, which we're not going to look at right now, because, well, Arthur D. Little didn't share that in its report. Irritating. But these 5 categories were then weighted, quote, according to their relevance for EV adoption, end quote. I mean, there's no information given on that either, so it could mean anything at all, which is why this is a study and not a scientific paper. It then takes those scores to give what you could call an overall readiness to switch state, what it calls the Global Electric Mobility Readiness Index, or GEMRIX. And finally, because we're not quite done, but nearly, I promise, it groups the countries into the global benchmark. That is, the top scoring country, then, quote, ambitious followers, emerging markets, and starters. Unfortunately, it only covers 15 countries, but it does have a fair spread of countries across the world. Okay, so there are some pretty significant caveats here, but let's take a look. So, pop pickers, let's look at the EV readiness charts. But unlike the countdown, we're going to start with the top of the charts for EV adoption, which is, of course, Norway. Its #1 ranking is ascribed to a combination of factors which cover all of the 5 domains Arthur D. Little cite as being significant. From a utility sector that's heavily based in cheap renewable energy, 98% of Norway's electricity production was from renewable energy as far back as 2016. To a relatively urban population, around 84% of Norwegians live in urban centres, and government incentives that have used both sticks and carrots to encourage EV adoption, with EVs and plug-in vehicles getting lower registration taxes, and for battery electric vehicles, zero taxation at the point of sale. They are also subject to no import taxation, particularly important in a country which doesn't build many of its own vehicles, at least not yet. To top it off, Norway's added in government incentives to install chargers starting back in the early 2000s. That means with its land area of 150,000 square miles, it, as of 2020, had over 2,000 CCS chargers alone. Compare that to the US with its land area of 3.8 million square miles and, as of 2020, just shy of 2,400 CCS chargers. I mean, the comparative ratio is really not good. Anyhow, by doing all of this, Norway has entered a state where effectively every person considers an EV or plug-in vehicle as their next choice. And that's because thanks to the various incentives, the infrastructure decisions that mean that parking lots, some of them are just for EVs, the ubiquitous nature of charging infrastructure, it's actually easier to own and drive an EV in Norway than it is a gas car. At least according to Arthur D. Little. Okay, so let's pick a country from the next gang, the ambitious followers. And for US dwellers, if you're hoping the US is going to be in this group, I'm afraid you're in for disappointment. There are 4 countries in this group. Unsurprisingly, China comes out top in this section, but then following it is Germany, Singapore and the UK. Germany's position this high in the league is a testament to its government's sudden switch to promote EVs. Having realised that the rest of the world's markets were going to make German auto manufacturing into an anachronism, it seems to have leapfrogged, with the federal government offering substantial incentives to increase EV adoption. The UK, in contrast, has been more of a gradual, steady climb, but following the COVID-19 pandemic, despite the UK government's decision to eliminate the plug-in car grant, which previously offered a chunk of change for those wanting to switch to electric, EV's share of the UK new and used vehicle market has grown and grown. In part, that's again due to a substantial urban population, an upcoming ban on fossil fuel vehicle registrations, and in many cities they now have low, ultra-low or even zero emission zones, where just driving in a vehicle that doesn't meet strict emissions criteria means that you get to pay an emissions charge, something which undoubtedly has significant equity concerns, but which does drive clean vehicle adoption in those cities. All that said, the UK has some significant challenges up ahead which may end up knocking it out of the ambitious followers category. The lack of cheap renewable energy, with the UK's reliance on older fossil fuel plants, and, as was recently reported, recalcitrance towards the construction of new solar generation is likely to slow the transition, especially with UK energy prices doing terrifying things and the UK's economy, well, in a double plus ungood state. Okay, so if the US isn't an ambitious follower, where are we? Well, we're an emerging EV market, along with Japan, the UAE and Thailand. The US still, according to Arthur D. Little, has some significant drawbacks for EV owners compared to their gas car owning siblings. But there is a big chunk of nuance here. Unlike most of the countries in this group, the US is divided. Yes, the percentage of folks who live in urban areas is pretty similar here to, say, Germany, the United Kingdom, or Norway. But unlike all those countries which are governed by a single federal government, the US has states which have wildly different governments that implement policies that are, at least in theory, what the folks in those states vote for. It's really a country with 56 sub-countries, and while the federal government has recently stepped in to encourage infrastructure development, and as we talked about back here, and linked in the description, the recent Inflation Reduction Act should, long-term, although definitely not short-term, bring benefits for domestic EV manufacturing with its expansion of the federal tax credit. State governments have been incredibly variable in their attitudes towards EVs, which means that your ownership experience and the incentives you might get will vary dramatically depending on where you are in the country. Coastal states, which have invested heavily in EV infrastructure and where the population is often much more dense, have the lion's share of DC rapid charging infrastructure, something that's evident by just glancing at a map. And in fact, the US, as it stands, has a total of 0.00 high-power charging stations per highway kilometre, something that's a factor of just how big the US is, and how those massive central states have chosen not to invest in the infrastructure to allow their citizens to choose meaningfully between EVs and ICE vehicles. Okay, so that's bad, and with only just over half of US residents considering a PHEV or an EV as their next vehicle, the US has a long way to go. But should the infrastructure rollout go anywhere near to plan, the US will, both Arthur D. Little and I agree on this, become an incredibly exciting place for EV adoption. The US's infrastructure is incredibly car dependent in a way that many other countries are not. It has one of the highest motorization rates on the globe, with 850 cars per 1,000 inhabitants, and a long average trip length, 15 miles or 25 kilometers. That's something that is unsustainable long term, but building out walkable cities and public transportation infrastructure takes time. Time that we cannot afford to spend burning fossil fuels if we want the planet to stay at least faintly hospitable. So while this study suggests that the US isn't ready just yet, it's on the precipice, teetering, and with just the right nudge it could slide into an EV utopia. And as the clamouring from new EV owners who are frustrated with lackluster charging networks gets louder, hopefully we'll get there. Now, if only we could futz with probability to ensure that was the outcome. You know, I'm just going to get a really hot cup of tea and pop the data into my Bambleweenie 57 submeson brain. Maybe we can come up with some way to do that. There's lots more information in the report, so we've dropped a link below if you want to spend some time nosing at the deets. And when you've done that, why not drop a comment below, let us know what you think about this study's rankings and just how ready where you are is for mass EV adoption. That's it for today. Thank you for joining me, and see you next time. If you liked the video, please consider giving it a thumbs up and sharing it with your friends. And if you really liked it, why not leave us a super thanks? It's easy to do, and everything you send goes towards helping us make great content. If you haven't already, please make sure you've subscribed to this channel and our other channel, Transport Evolved Take 2, and give the bell a gentle ring to make sure you're told when our next video goes live. Thanks on behalf of the entire TE crew go out to everyone who makes TE possible. That includes everyone who supports us on Patreon and on YouTube, as well as those of you who just watch and share the videos. If you're a supporter at the charged up level, you'll see your name right here on my right. And if you just joined, we're sorry if your name isn't showing. We currently render the list out every week or so, but sometimes our videos are produced a few weeks in advance. Thanks to our self-driving tier supporters Chris Maxwell, Pedro Muro Pinheiro, Patrick Boyarski, Bennett Elder, Brian Newton, David Kitchen, Michael Goad, Ricky Leong, Andrew Martin, Guido Trahota, Brophy Wolf, Tesla in the Gong, Gordon C, Stephen O'Donoghue, Kyle Hodgson, Anthony Coates, Regine Fellows, Dan Blair, Jim Burness, Chris Ascenter, Chris and Michael Johnson, Peter Dillinger and Denny Hyde, and of course, out of this world, thanks to our Starman supporters, Anonymous Freak, Marcel Ward, Reggie Watts, Rory Litwin, Joe Bresney, Reed R, JP Fagerback, Russ, Will Grayland, Matthew Drobnak, Kevin Burrowbridge, John Lyons, Andrew Glenn, Paul Conway, Laura Reynolds, and of course, Ian. If you want to be part of that amazing list, you can join Patreon at the link below, hit the join button down there to support us on YouTube, or show us your support through Bitcoin, Ko-fi, or our cool swag store. Links are all down there. And if you're unable to support us financially, just know that watching the video and sharing it really makes a difference to our ad revenue. Thanks for joining me, and as always, keep evolving.